Speaking of supporting the podcast, I wanted to say thank you to AB2793, who left a 5-star review and called the show a must listen. They said the show had me at the title. I'm a huge Harry Potter fan, and I love the idea that you have for the show. The hosting is wonderful, and I love the idea of going chapter by chapter of one of my favorite series of all time. The discussion and dissection of each chapter is so fun for me, and I really enjoy listening. I would definitely recommend this show. I love reading these reviews. I love sharing these reviews. I love hosting this show. Thank you, seriously, for all of the kind words. And to the rest of you listening, I encourage you to leave a review as well. Hopefully you enjoy the show as much as AB2793 does. It makes me feel good. It helps more people give a chance to the show as they're scrolling through and they see positive things that people have said. And I just appreciate it. So go ahead and leave one if you don't mind. Now, it's time for
Lumos.
Let's raise our wand and light the tips. It's time to illuminate Fred and George Weasley, who were on absolutely full display in this chapter, from their ninja-like reflexes, their MacGyver-like skill set, each dragging a pair of gigantic Gryffindors for the sheer daring and nerve to pull off this rescue mission. Let that visual sink in. Solid, just brass Gryffindors, like the knockers on Dumbledore's office. Yeah, I don't think you needed that visual. Anyway, not to mention the mini detective instincts that they're all, unknowingly putting together in real time on the way back for the whole, who would have Dobby been the house elf of? It's that mystery they pretty much figured out, except for the why. And they also took their lumps from Molly like complete pros of mischief. They've clearly been on the receiving end of her maybe once or twice at this point in their lives. So today I want to bring you into my personal headcanon on these two a little bit. And for the most part, we're doing so based on them as a character in it of themselves. Like the twins. Do they have their own personalities? Of course. Are they unique? Yes. But do they literally have a single page in the entire series where they show up individually? Yep, pretty much. So while I'm not an expert on twins, nor was the author of this series, and I'm treating them as a package deal, it's because that's what we get on the page, not because I think that they can't stand alone as characters. Now, about that headcanon. I picture these two kids growing up just every day in the garage with their dad. While he's tinkering on muggle radios, Swiss Army knives, rubber ducks, and whatever else he can get his hands on, they're right there next to him, just completely fascinated by it, just as much as he is. I think Bill and Charlie were already older. Percy would have been a mama's boy and probably not interested in any of this muggle shit. Ron and Ginny were in diapers. I'm guessing those two were the ones that really took to Arthur. The excitement that they have, along with Ron, when Arthur came home in this chapter was very much like dad is my hero type of vibes to me. I doubt Percy gave a shit when dad came home. But these two probably got giddy every single day. And they probably loved the time that they got to spend playing with dad's toys out in the garage with him. And as they grew older, as their interests in it started to shift, I think. I think it wasn't just about being like dad anymore. They wanted to learn whatever they could to help in their shenanigans. And I'm betting they were already thinking about experiments in what would honestly later become the joke shop. Think about it. Before you can develop your own magical products, don't you need a foundational knowledge of magical products, probably. In all reality, these two are the Hogwarts version of engineers. And they couldn't just wake up at 16 and realize they could create shit from scratch. That's just not how the world works. It all started as kids in the garage with Arthur, taking muggle stuff apart, figuring out how it all works, how it's assembled, how to break it, then how to fix it, how to manipulate it, and then, as their magical abilities improved, how to enchant it. From there, they went on to make slightly different versions of things, and then those slightly different versions became magical versions, and then they started making their own things from scratch, and they just graduated to their own magic. It really is a real, like, rags to riches journey for these two, and we learn later that they're actually very, very gifted wizards. Hermione says so in Half-Blood Prince. I think they've been working toward it for a lot longer than what we see on the pages of these books. I think that while they didn't have a business plan for a joke shop necessarily, their natural curiosities were leading them in that direction, probably as soon as they could walk. And of course, spending time with their dad. That's it. That's my Weasley twins headcanon. Let me know where it lands for you. Now, let's do some
divination.
It's time to highlight 4 moments in the chapter that foreshadow something to come in the future. Fred and George picking the lock, sneaking Harry's school stuff from the cupboard, and rescuing him after getting in trouble for using magic kind of has a hint of our first shadow for a few moments. Like, perhaps, when the Order of the Phoenix comes to sneak Harry away from the Dursleys after he gets in trouble for doing magic. Sensing a theme. I also like the small nuance that they have to pick the lock on his door. It always kind of reminds me of the knife that Sirius gives to Harry to, pick locks. The one he uses to get into Umbridge's office in that very same book. The second foreshadow is a quote. Percy's been acting very oddly this summer. This side comment on the flight back to the Burrow, I've landed on flight, by the way, not ride, flight. After they've extracted the Chosen One, the note about Percy kind of becomes a theme in the book. I'll be honest, it's great. Later on, when it comes up that Ginny caught Percy doing something, the author was totally hinting that she caught him during some of his alone time, but it turns out he was making out with a girl, not playing with himself. It's a fairly hilarious background mystery that reminds us that these are kids in school with hormones, puberty, and that kind of shit, and it makes me laugh. I don't need the visual of where that makeout session might have been headed, and I certainly don't need the visual of what was implied as the little Percy red herring, but it's hilarious that it's included. Lighthearted, if you will. The third foreshadow is another quote. You could have died. You could have been seen. You could have lost your father his job. Molly blowing up on her kids Mama Bear style has another hint of foreshadowing to very soon in this very book when Ron and Harry can't get to Hogwarts on the express because the barrier is blocked, so they can't get to the train. And instead of the logical choice of waiting for the adults, they steal the car and they fly to school. They almost die, and they're nearly expelled, which every Potterhead knows is a fate worse than death. They're seen and they nearly lose Arthur his job. Our fourth and final foreshadow for this episode is yet another quote. What a night! 9 raids! 9! Arthur Weasley recounting his job and these raids is also going to come back up later, particularly when Harry sees the Malfoys in Borgin and Burke's, trying to sell off some of the shady shit that they have just in case they're raided. And then there's also that dad fight that's coming up, and of course, the Malfoys do end up getting raided. It's kind of a whole thing, and this is our first hint at it right here. And a thing that I heard somebody say, where was it? I want to say it was one of the guest hosts on the restricted section. I think it was actually when they covered the Chamber of Secrets book, but my memory is just awful. But this person in particular suggested that the raids that Arthur is going on is in reaction to the end of book 1 when Harry stops the parasitic version of Voldemort protruding from the back of Quirrell's head from getting a hold of the Sorcerer's or Philosopher's Stone and getting a body and riches and the ability to live forever. I think their point was, with Voldemort coming so close to a return at that time, and at that time the Ministry of Magic didn't at least seem completely incompetent, it gave Arthur some leeway and rope to be more aggressive, I guess you could say, with trying to catch people who might have objects and be trying to help facilitate a Voldemort return. I thought it was an interesting take. I probably butchered it completely, and maybe if somebody over there is listening, Christina, please help me if you remember. They can set me straight on exactly what that was, but I think that was the gist of it, and I always found that very, very interesting. So before we move on, I've got a couple other honorable mentions getting back to the foreshadowing divination bit of our own episode here. Ginny's crush on Harry kind of becomes a big deal. Wedding bells? Anyone? And Molly gives us our first name drop of Gilderoy Lockhart in this chapter, who becomes a very big deal in this book. Douchebag? Anyone? Sorry. That leads us to giving away some
house points.
In true Hogwarts fashion, these points are completely subjective, with no oversight, and are at my full discretion. This week, I'm giving house points to Fred and George Weasley, the twins. They're getting 20 points each for their heroics in rescuing Harry from the Dursleys' hell. Ron is going to get 15 for the same reason, but the twins ninja'd their way in to get Harry's shit, and one of them drove the car, and that just earns a few more points in my book. Also, I'm going to give some points to Molly Weasley. She's going to get 5 for her mama bearness, her use of manual labor as a punishment, but also still feeding them like kings before she makes them go do the manual labor. She loves her kids, and she was only mad because she was scared for their safety. And that's sweet. So now I'm going to take away some points from Vernon Dursley, losing another 5 points for trying to grab Harry and stop him from getting in the car and leaving. That's it. Aside from that ugly Vernon-shaped blemish, it was actually a really happy chapter. So I will add these points into my nerdy-ass spreadsheet and tally them up for the end of this season's Bingy Awards. So now before we go, I have to acknowledge the moments in this chapter that were utterly
Ridiculous.
It's not an episode of The Binge if we don't call out what didn't make any sense. Starting with, I harped on the underage magic thing, the trace, last chapter a lot. So I'm not going to do it again this chapter, but I am going to point out that if you have to explain the technicality of why a flying car doesn't trip the same alarm bells as a flying pudding, it's probably dumb. But credit for consistency in at least that rule for the trace, because when it comes back later, when they have to use brooms and thestrals and the like to leave because they don't want the trace on Harry to catch them using magic during the Seven Potters thing, they stick to this same theme. So I'm glad that there was at least that level of consistency. Everything else is fairly confusing. As enjoyable as this chapter is, I'm just going to say it. It's a bit ridiculous that 3 children were able to successfully sneak out, steal a car, make it fly, not get spotted by anybody, know to use cloud cover to hide themselves, shield themselves, if you will, have the proper towing equipment handy to pull the bars off of Harry's window, break into a suburban home with a parked getaway car hovering at the 2nd story level, and back across the country with the 4th child and everything that 4th child owns, basically. And all of it just went perfectly. Not only did nobody die or get caught out and about, everything was just absolutely perfect. Until they got home and caught by Molly Weasley. That part was realistic. That's literally the only part of it that went the way that this goes ever. The rest just, even in this universe, it's just too perfect, too rosy. With that, we've reached the end of this episode of The Binge. As always, shout out to producer Jack, who I work like a dog. Remember to follow and subscribe to the show on whatever podcast player you're using right now. And if it supports a rating and review option, please leave one. And if you're so inclined, check out the additional benefits that are now available on patreon.com/belatedbinge. There's a link in the show notes for that. If you're reading along, next episode, we're covering chapter 4 of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets at Flourish and Blots. Until then, I'll see you next time on the Belated Binge podcast. It's a bit small, said Ron quickly. Not like that room you had with the muggles. And I'm right underneath the ghoul in the attic. He's always banging on the pipes and groaning. But Harry, grinning widely, said, "This is the best house I've ever been in." Ron's ears went pink.